First off, let me say thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I hope that you will learn, some really great tips and tricks for tracing your Italian heritage. Maybe learn a little bit of history along the way, and hopefully just learn just a little bit more on how to get started with this fascinating area of family research. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Why Italian genealogy? So the numbers aren't exact, but probably roughly around 5 million Italians will immigrate to the United States. And of that number, the vast majority will immigrate between the years 1880 to 1924, when various immigration restrictions shut down the flow of immigration from Europe to the United States. Now, we won't really have a chance to get into it as much today, but it should be noted that the United States is only one of many places that Italians will immigrate to in this time, including Canada, Australia, and particularly South America. In fact, Argentina, over 2/3 of the population actually has Italian ancestry. Be that as it may, our focus today, of course, will be on the United States. And roughly somewhere between 16 to 17 million Americans have at least some Italian heritage. I've seen numbers all the way up to, say, well over 20 million. It can be somewhat difficult to say, but most historians and genealogists estimate that Italian is probably the 5th biggest ethnicity in the United States. So as such, with such big numbers, it makes a lot of sense that we'd want to do a program on researching this large ethnic group. So here's a map that shows the concentration of Americans with Italian ancestry. Now, unsurprisingly, it's still concentrated here in the Northeast, right? So, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Florida, and then, of course, other places like, say, Illinois, primarily the Chicago area. There are a lot of reasons for this, and we'll get into that as we go along. So why do Italians want to come to the United States? Today, Italy is a very successful country. It's economically successful, no real wars to speak of, and is widely considered a pretty great place to live. But 150 odd years ago, this was not the case, right? Particularly in the south of Italy, desperate poverty, a population explosion driven by new access to American foods, as well as increasing hygiene methods. There's political trouble. This is the period where Italy is attempting to reunify, but there's lots of, to be blunt, there's lots of violent things that happen along the way. Natural disasters don't get talked about enough, but there's plenty of earthquakes and tidal waves that kill thousands of people. It's generally a pretty rough situation. And there's not a lot of cause to hope that things will get better. America, on the other hand, is the golden land of opportunity, right? Where, as is traditional in a lot of these immigrant stories that you'll see, irregardless of ethnicity, the jobs that are available here in the United States for immigrants are often tough jobs that many native-born Americans don't really want, and the wages aren't great by American standards. However, by Italian standards, they're incredibly high. In some cases, 9 times the average of Italian wages for similar work. So Italians will respond to this very naturally, and in particular, Southern Italians will respond to this. Italians from all over the country of Italy will come to the United States and become Americans. That being said, over 2/3 will come from south of Rome. This area is known as the Mezzogiorno, which roughly translates to noon in Italian. And this is a reference basically to the incredibly hot noon sun that beats down on this part of Italy. Southern Italy was comparatively speaking, politically fragmented. It had a lot of poverty. It had a lot of, natural disasters. One of the things we don't talk about, but there's literally tidal waves that almost destroyed places like Messina and killed thousands of people. And paradoxically, even when Italy becomes united, things actually get worse for Southern Italians, as they're subject to many taxes that they had not been previously. And of course, many of the young men are subject to conscription for various amounts of time. And I should note, conscription is one of the strongest push reasons for immigration that nobody really talks about quite as much, but it's super important. Even today, parts of like Calabria and Basilicata and Sicily are still among some of the poorest areas in Western Europe. So, what are they doing? Well, like many immigrant groups, like I was talking about earlier, they're going to come over and do a lot of hard manual labor jobs, particularly in, say, factories or construction work. Construction work, like so, building roads, buildings, you know, working in various industrial plants, things like that. Um, Initially, most of them will be young single men, right? I think it may kind of mess with the national mythology, but at first, many Italians are not necessarily interested in becoming Americans. Their goal is to come to the United States, work one of these tough jobs, make a lot of money, once again by Italian standards, and then go back to the old country and usually set yourself up by buying a business or a farm or something like that. And technology has progressed to the point by the 1880s, 1890s, let alone the 1900s, where, you're taking steamships over. It's not great. It's a bit like taking a Greyhound bus, right? So, and the price of tickets, because of, once again, the technology and the competition from the various steamship lines, it's relatively cheap to do so. So, many Italian immigrants will go back and forth between Italy more than once. I believe the record that I've seen is one man in particular went back to Italy, back and forth to America 18 times, to give you an idea of just how common this was. And even some cases, many Italians that will do work throughout the United States, they will come back to New York City in the winter, where they and a bunch of their buddies basically will buy an apartment so they can split the cost and stay there. Some, once again, because the cost of living in Italy is so much cheaper, they'll they'll literally just go back home for the winter, right? And then come back in the spring when there's all this kind of construction work. That being said, obviously a lot of them did end up staying, but it's an important thing to look for as we go along. With all genealogy, we must start with ourselves and work our way back, right? It's always important to walk before you run. So, when doing your family history on this side of the Atlantic, you start with traditional genealogical sources, right? The census, vital records, church records, if possible. And if you can get to the immigrant ancestor, right, that's when things really kick off. And you'll want to take a look at the American side of immigration records, right? So, naturalizations, passenger lists, passports, which may be in your possession. All of these contain vital information that will help you to begin to start being able to do research in Italy itself. And fortunately, because of the time period when Italians are starting to come to the United States, many of these records have advanced to the point where they will actually give you specifics, right? So a naturalization will hopefully include the village or town or city versus just say Italy, which isn't helpful at all, as we'll see. I should also note Italians, even today, may not necessarily think of themselves as Italians first, but rather are a product of a town, a city, a region. And so like tends to move with like. You'll see this on, say, passenger lists where young men from the same village will go over together. They'll hang out in the same places. As always with genealogy, if you're running into trouble, friends, associates, and neighbors can often tell you where you need to take another look. So let's say I've got all that, right? Let's say I've got Pop. I know he's my immigrant ancestor. What do I need to do to start doing research in Italy itself? Well, The most important thing that you can do, or I should say that you need really, because it's not even that, you can kind of like just try to like enter a name or something. You absolutely need the exact village or town your immigrant ancestor came from. A region like Basilicata or Sicily or Calabria, it's just not going to do it. The names are too similar. You'll be chasing your tail from until the crack of doom, right? You also need the exact original name. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, you need it because that's what you'll be looking for in the records, right? Lots of Italians will obviously change their name. Now, because Italian and English are somewhat related, you'll often see people migrating to the English variant of whatever their Italian name is, but not always, right? There's always the pressure to assimilate, discrimination. Lots of things go into this, but you need the exact original name if you're going to make progress. Fortunately, things like naturalizations and passenger lists will often be able to supply this relatively easily. The other thing you need is an exact birth date. It's one of those key identifiers, right? There's tons of people named, Luigi Abruzzi or something. But if you can have that birth date, that will help you not only eliminate others, it can tell you exactly where you need to go when we start to take a look at these various records online that we're going to explore. Okay, so a bit overall about Italy itself first. So obviously, Italy is the country. The regions correspond to states, right? So like Sicily, of course, is an island, but it's also a state. Then there's the provinces, which roughly correspond to like counties here in the United States. So they tend to be, well, depending on which county you're talking about, a bit bigger. And the provinces are important because, as we'll see when we start talking about it, this is where you will have to look for a lot of your immigrant ancestors' records, right? Because they'll be funneled up to the province's archives over time. And far and away, the most important thing is the commune. This is, this is the root word for our, community, right? It's a municipality, town, township, city, village, whatever you want to call it. This is the heart and soul of Italian genealogy. Almost all records, both civil and religious, are created and kept, at least initially, and usually and often enough the originals are as well, will be kept at the commune level. I want to talk a little bit about this term here at the bottom, campanalissimo, and basically it's a rough translation, but it's village mindedness. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, Italy is a relatively young country. Obviously, Italian culture is, thousands of years old. That being said, it's highly individualistic, right? Venice is different than Rome, is different than Naples, is different than Sicily or Palermo. And that's good for us because it means that it helps to distinguish where we need to look. I've read, many Italian memoirs where they, the outpouring about their village, their home, usually with a healthy amount of, shall we say, unkindness towards people in other villages or regions, is incredibly common, right? Italians want you to know where they come from. And this can be very helpful for the researcher because, that's what you need to do to be able to go further back. So we're going to start off with Italian civil records. One, they're the easiest to use. Two, you will have widespread access online here in the United States. We're going to work our way through a test case here towards the end. So it's important to know kind of how civil records work in Italy because understanding the era you're looking in can often supply the answers for what do I need to find, what is possible to find, and where do I go from here. Much like Western Germany, Italian civil records start with Napoleon Bonaparte, right? When he organizes Italy after conquering large chunks of it in the early 19th century, he forces the Italian states to begin keeping civil records, right? So births, marriages, and deaths, right? And this goes from roughly 1805 to 1815 when he is deposed. When Napoleon's deposed, then either the various Italian states are on their own or are under the control of the Austrian government. So this is a bit exaggerated. Basically, the rule of thumb is north of Rome, the Italian states will stop keeping civil records until about 1865. South of Rome, so the kingdom of the two Sicilies, right? Naples and Sicily and places like that, they will continue to keep these civil records, right? Which is very good for us here in America because 2/3 of all Italian Americans will come from south of Rome, right? In this period, roughly 1815 to 1865, is known as the Restoration, right? Because they restore a lot of the governments that Napoleon had knocked off. And then you come to the Italian Civil Era, which is 1866 to the present day. And this is, they kind of hit from 1866 on, everywhere within the Italian state should be keeping vital records on births, marriages, and deaths. Obviously, have to check the individual place, record destruction happens, etc. But generally speaking, from 1866 and on, there's almost certainly a record somewhere. While there will be different forms as time goes on, one of the really great things about Italian records is they standardize very early on. I've seen some from like the 1830s where they're already using pre-printed sheets and they're just filling it out. So you have to get kind of comfortable with the Italian, but once but you can easily read the pre-printed forms and largely work your way from there. As I was saying, Italian civil records include the big three, right? Birth, marriage, and death. In northern Italy, you're not out of luck necessarily, because they didn't keep, I should say, they did not continue to keep vital records in the way they did south of Rome. The Austrians basically just encouraged the church to continue recording, baptisms, marriages, deaths, confirmations, right? The sacraments. And because the Catholic Church in the Austrian Empire has elements of being a state church, many of those parish records, unlike what you'll see in southern Italy, with copies will be made and dropped off at this various state archive branches. Well, that's all well and good, Logan, but where do I go for these? Well, the first place you should probably go to is Family Search. Family Search will have many of them, once again, particularly for Southern Italy. They will not have the actual record, but many of them have been indexed, right? So that can help you while you're going to be looking at our main website today, which is Portale Antenati, right? Which is Portal of the Ancestors, an Italian state government-run website that has digitized millions of records and is probably the second place to stop after Family Search once you're doing research in Italy itself. So the other really big one I'm going to talk about today too is, unsurprisingly, Italian church records, right? Italy obviously has arguably the best Catholic church records in the world, and they will follow the main sacraments, baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and deaths, right? This has been done ever since roughly 1563. Though, of course, it is highly dependent on what area you're talking about. That being said, by the mid to late 1600s, pretty much all the Italian parishes are doing it one way or the other, right? This is in response to the Reformation. Thanks to the Council of Trent, the Lutherans had started keeping baptisms, marriages, and deaths. And so the Catholic Church felt the need that they should also start doing this, right? So once again, depending on where you're looking in Italy, right? Once again, so important for knowing what records to look for. North of Rome, you will see many of these church records, which will be often be described as church records, available in the state archives. South of Rome, most of these will not be available online. Just like so many church records, it's often up to the individual bishop. And as of right now, not a ton have chosen to embrace digitization. But as we always say around here, hope springs eternal. I was talking a little bit about Family Search and Portale Antenati, but let's break it down a little more, right? So hopefully you've got the three things we talked about, right? You've got your ancestor's original name, you've got his or her rough birth date, and most importantly, you have the village. So then we're going to take a look at both Family Search and Portale Antenati. I always recommend starting with Family Search just because they've done a pretty solid job of indexing a lot of these Southern Italian records. And even though they will not have the actual document, which of course, as good genealogists know, we always want the document, not just the extracted information, because, people make mistakes. Happens all the time. But it can often give you clues about where to go. Now, Portale Antenati is a really cool website. It's from the Italian government. It's fairly easy to use. They've equipped it with a button where you can hit it and it will switch it from Italian to English. Obviously, the records themselves will not switch to Italian to English, but navigating the site will go to English, and it's very straightforward. It's very intuitive. You'll start with a map, and then once again, it breaks down by the regional archives, right? So you need to find out your village and what region it's in, because that will probably hold the records from 100+ years ago that usually most people's immigrant ancestors and further back will be held. Absent, of course, the church, which, as I was talking about earlier, may not necessarily be available. The state of digitization of the archives in question is green, yellow, and red. Green is supposedly they've gotten everything, but I should note that they do include a disclaimer that new things are uploaded as time goes on. Italy, like much of the EU, is subject to privacy laws. So usually the most recent things you'll find there are from the 1940s or 1950s, but even that's still pretty rare, right? But fortunately for most Italian Americans, we're looking to go backwards. And yellow, of course, is they've got some stuff, but more stuff is coming. And red is they don't have anything online as of yet. So let's start with the birth records. The Atti di Nascita, the attainer of birth. Pretty straightforward. So many of these Italian records, basically each village will compile them after a year. There will be an index in the back, almost always, and give you the entry number for the particular person you're looking for. It's pretty straightforward. You'll always find the kid's name on the left or right, nice big bold letters. You'll find some fairly standard boilerplate. Usually it's the mayor or some other small Italian village official naming the parents. The kid was born such and such day, usually because the actual birth record may come a couple days after the child is born. The thing that they're really going to look for is they're going to try to hustle the kid to the baptismal fount for religious purposes, and because the extremely high rate of infant mortality at the time. So the birth record can come a bit later, but they will include the actual birth date. Usually they will, you won't really see it here, but they're supposed to come with the baptismal record as well. And usually there will be witnesses, right? Occasionally, I talk about standardization with Italian records, and there is a fair bit of it. There's also a lot of stuff that's just completely like some village official went back and updated it. I've seen Italian birth records where people will, go back and like, oh, he married such and such on this date in this town. Or, some of these will also name grandparents, if you can imagine that. How exciting is that? One of the biggest things I tell people when doing Italian research, translate everything. You just don't know what kind of treasures you can find in here. All right. And speaking of treasures, let's move on to perhaps the most important of Italian records, and that's the matrimony, right? Love and marriage. So, matrimony records, once again, fairly straightforward. You'll find each year usually bound in a book with an index and a fairly boilerplate. I married this couple. They're with the coming of Italian statehood in the 1870s, there will occasionally be headbutting between the civil government and the church over who does marriages. So if you're not seeing a marriage, it may be because they refused to get a license at the time and just did it at the church, or vice versa, depending on their politics. Right. So bear that in mind. That being said, the fact is, a lot of these marriages, they're almost like business contracts. You will see more than births or deaths. The vast majority of records that you will see in most Italian archives will relate to marriages, right? Because you have marriage bans announcing a marriage, a couple weeks, kind of like the dramatic scene from the movie. If anyone has any reason to oppose this, stand up now or forever hold your peace, but you have to do it a couple weeks in advance. If depending on where they're getting married, if either the bride or groom is from another village, the band will have to be posted in that village as well. You will often find, particularly in southern Italy, like promises of marriage, right? Which is pretty straightforward, which is, I totally promise to marry you. Once again, very contractual. And then marriage supplements, right? Which can often contain different things such as, extended family, approval from our church official, things like that. Once again, containing a wide variety of different possibilities. When in doubt, check everything. And then finally, morti, right? Deaths. Deaths are fairly straightforward. Once again, you've got this pre-printed form where someone, often enough the spouse or neighbors of a particular person, we found such and such person dead. He lives at such and such place. His, spouse was, or is, I should say, such and such. Place of residence will usually include parents' names, date, and place of death, right? Pretty straightforward. Not very different than what you'll see in most death certificates here in the United States. But once again, got to check everything. Now, I thought about not talking about this record group, but as you're going to see from what we go through, it turned out to be so useful, and you'll see it enough that I think I have to talk about it at least a little bit, right? So this is atti diversi, right? These are diverse records, okay? And they tend to be in their own separate thing. You'll usually see them before 1866 in that restoration period we were talking about. Well, it's just like in the title, they're diverse records. They contain random bits of information that may not necessarily fit easily into birth, marriage, or death. You'll find entries about the census, passenger list, draft cards. Occasionally, you'll have supplemental death records, as we're going to explore here. You'll find supplemental birth records if there's something that's not exactly above board, seems a little harsh, but if there's something a little different about a particular birth, right? You'll find incredibly different things in here. And if you can find one of these digitized in whatever provincial archives you're looking at through Portale Antenati, and you have questions about why can't you find, X, Y, and Z, the diverse records may be the place to go, right? Okay, so I wanted to do a test case with everybody just to kind of, give you guys a good guide on like, all right, how do I do any of this? Okay, so I decided to do, obviously, one of the most famous Italian Americans to ever live, beloved American entertainer, Dean Martin. So I figured out pretty quickly that Dean Martin, That was not his birth name, right? He was born Dino Paul Crocetti on June 7th, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, to a Guy Crocetti and Angela Mara. So the first place I went, after looking at, like, death index and all these kinds of things, was the 1920 census, right? Because he's 3 years old. I found them all pretty quickly. You see Dino and his brother William there. And up top, you can see his family, his father, Guy Crocetti, and his mother, Angela. I decided that I would start tracing his father's side of the family and just see where we ended up. So, taking a look at Guy Crocetti, I figured out a couple things fairly quickly. His marriage record popped up very quickly. And take a look at that top entry right there, right? His name, Guy, is a nickname or an American name, what have you. His full name is Gaetano Crocetti. And note, this marriage record includes his occupation, right? He's a barber. And I should note that while we mainly talked about Italians doing like hard manual labor, barber is also one of the key economic niches that Italians will occupy in this time period. A bit like Greeks and candy stores. It's just one of the, for whatever reason, it's just one of those things. But even better, right? I have his place of birth, Monte Silvano, in the county of Teramo in Italy. It even gives me his parents. So his mother, Maria Focosa, and his father, Giovanni. But of course, you want to make sure that you've got a whole bunch of stuff because occasionally you find one document, maybe it's a little bit different than the others. So we try to assemble a bunch of documentation and, make the best guess that we can. So I found his naturalization. Once again, everything checks out, even gives me, exactly when he came over and what ship he was on, all that kind of good stuff. Then I found him in his passenger list. Once again, just building it out. I found out he had a brother in Steubenville, which is probably how he ended up there. Once again, his parents, his place of birth in Monte Silvano, all that kind of good stuff, right? So I now have his name. I have his place of birth. I even have his parents' names, supposedly, right? So now I'm off to Family Search and Portale Antenati so I can start trying to trace them in the old country. I went to Family Search first, and I was able to find Gaetano very quickly. Unfortunately, they had indexed it slightly wrong. Not uncommon. The exact date of December 7th was correct, but it turns out he was born in 1893, not 1894. And I should note, Gaetano himself seemed to be very confused, as I didn't have, for abbreviation's sake, I didn't show all the documentation, but he listed everywhere from 1898 to 1893 as his year of birth. Does happen from time to time, but fortunately, I had enough information, particularly with the village, that I was able to find the actual record fairly quickly. It's very straightforward here, right? You have Gaetano Crocetti, his parents, Giovanni Crocetti and Maria Fracoso. This will also give me their rough ages at the time, which will hopefully enable me to find them in either birth records or marriage records or things like that. It's one of those things that's pretty important because Portale Antenati does have a name search function, but it does not, unsurprisingly, when you're dealing with cursive, it just doesn't really work as well as just utilizing the human eye and the indexes that you'll find in the backs of all these various collections, right? So, all right, so I'm back in the old country. I want to know more about Giovanni and Maria. So I start heading backwards. I was fairly quickly able to find their marriage record. A very interesting marriage record here, in that, for one, while Giovanni is from Montesilvano. It should be noted that Maria, his wife, was actually born in the what was then a an independent village, Castellammare Adriatico, but it's now is literally a part of the city of Pescara, which is the overarching region that Montesilvano and Castellammare are a part of, and therefore was where I went on Portale Antonati to look these up. I wanted to check and see if there were some other marriage records, and I did actually find that they had a marriage bond for 1884. But unfortunately for me, it did not contain any additional information. Once again, I was fairly confused though, because I had noted that the family search transcription seemed to be pretty odd, as it seemed that they had decided that both Giovanni and Maria's father was named Ignacio. And that seemed a little odd to me. Not impossible, I suppose, but I decided to take a closer look. And I wanted to take a look at some other records to try to get an idea of what we were really trying to see here. I took a look, once again, fairly easily found Giovanni's death record in the larger collection on Portale Antonati. Once again, helped by Family Search's indexing. And it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't really tell me anything I didn't know other than like his date of death, his marriage, where he was living at the time, which of course is very important because my next step here will be to look into the various church records. And for that, you need the parish, right? So that would be very helpful, right? But I still have some work to do because I haven't found Giovanni's birth record yet. I was still so confused by this Ignacio thing, but I decided maybe that the birth record would have something. Note now that he is born before Italian unification, and so we are in the Restoration period. And I looked and I looked. I probably spent like a day just looking through like a 10-year period of these indexes, and I just couldn't find anything. But I was determined that there must be something, because everything had been very specific about, when he was born, and the information I had found in the death and the marriage and the birth of his son Gaetano, as well as in the birth of Gaetano's siblings that I didn't really get into, but was fairly useful in just establishing these things, because it just keeps repeating it over and over again. And then I thought to myself, let's go back and look at that marriage document. And I took a look with the naked eye, and I realized what had been transcribed as Ignacio was actually ignorato. But, they were ignorant. They didn't know who the father or the mother was. Like, oh, okay. So then I noticed that there was some diversity records from the time period. And I was fairly fortunate because there's only about 5 pages for, the year Giovanni was born. And I found out that Giovanni had actually been an orphan. He was actually found next to the church in what's roughly translated as the adoption wheel, or in Italian, La Ruota del Trovatello. It almost feels like a fairy tale, but basically, this was invented Pope Innocent III, where you would have usually a nun on standby next to a kind of a sliding opening into the church, so you don't just leave the kid exposed to the elements, right? And you can just kind of push him in and ring the bell. Indiana has similar things with, at its fire departments here in recent years, you may have heard about. It's kind of the same principle. They also wanted it small enough so you couldn't, drop off a 5-year-old or something. What this diverse record list is basically the person who found him and when they found him, right, in that hatch. So he's an orphan. And I also had noted that Maria her parents had also been listed as, ignorato. So she's almost certainly an orphan as well. So my next step for going back further would be to try to contact the parish register office where he was found and see what kinds of records we might have. Honestly, in a strictly paperwork sense, we're probably not going to get any further, but the attempt must be made. And then, of course, you get into things like DNA testing and stuff. So that's kind of just an example of going through here and trying to see how we use the evidence to go that one step further back and just keep exploring and hopefully, break through a brick wall. Let's talk about a couple tips and tricks though, before we turn it over to questions, just to give you an idea of things that might be useful in your search. One, Italian women traditionally and today continue to use their maiden name after marriage. You'll note even in America, Gaetano does not list Maria as Maria Crocetti, right? She's still Facosa. And you'll see that across the board. You'll see that in naturalizations, passenger lists, things like that. That might very well be why you're not finding something. The vast majority of civil records from like the 1860s on will have, thank goodness, an index in the back, right? It's alphabetical and gives you the entry number, relatively straightforward. When trying to look for church records, always start with the parish and work your way up, right? But the parish is usually the best place to go. And once again, I should note, north of Rome, there's a very good chance those parish records are available in the state archives, even on Portale Antonati. South of Rome, usually not, but that's why it's the rule of thumb. You got to check because you just never know. Explore the history of the village and the surrounding area, right? I was having, there's tons of Castamares in Italy. I couldn't figure out which one because it had been absorbed into the much bigger city of Pescara, a couple decades ago, right? But once I started looking into the history of Pescara, it popped up almost immediately and helped me understand where to go from there. Each state archive for the region is just a little bit different, right? They're going to have, the births, deaths, and marriages that we talked about, but you want to explore the entire digitized collection because you never know what might be the thing that can be the key to unlocking it all. And finally, translate everything. As I talked about earlier, and I think this is just a reflection of Campanalissimo, it's the village life. This is a community like this, right? Everybody's in everybody's business. So they go back and they update birth records. I've seen marriage records where they'll put in like, oh, and such was working for this guy, or some just random things, some of which are more useful than others, but all of which will make our ancestors come alive as people, right? So when in doubt, translate everything. Now, this is just simply a beginner's guide. To be an Italian is to be lucky for many reasons, but particularly for the genealogist, Italy is an embarrassment of riches, right? And so due to the time constraints, we only had time to cover the very foundational basics, right? But notary records, military records, real property, many of these have been digitized and are available to look through and can often be incredible gold mines for the researcher. I should note notary records in particular, some of them can go back, even past church records. Although, frankly, that's super advanced Italian genealogy because many of them are written in a secret script that was only available to people that were in the guild of notaries. So that's a bit above my pay grade, but maybe someday. Someday, perhaps we can tackle advanced Italian genealogy together. Why don't we turn it over to questions now?
We do have a couple questions. First, I do see one that is asking if there is a location where we can get a replay of the presentation, and there is. So if you go to our YouTube channel, might be a week or two, but the recording of the presentation will be on our YouTube playlist, so you can keep an eye out for that. There's a link at the top left of our website, genealogycenter.org. It's the play button. So the next question is, what is your best recommendation for transcription or translation of Italian records?
Well, so the first thing I would always recommend is familiarize yourself with the pre-printed forms, particularly for say 1866 and on, because that can tell you what to look for, right? Bureaucracy looks the same in any language. I would say, you know, I myself have used Chat GPT, and that has been solid. However, I have found that if I just, like, say, upload an entry from Portale Antonati, it will goof it up pretty bad. And that's the same thing for like Google Translate and things like that. I tend to rely pretty heavily on the fact that most of this stuff is fairly basic, birth, marriage, death. Uh, but you have to look at it closely. A lot of times, what I'll actually do with records is I'll take them into, my like photo editor, and I'll chop them up into thirds and like really focus in on the particular spot that I'm looking for, upload that and say, please translate it. And I've had much better results. But honestly, I had a couple years of Latin in high school, so that kind of helps. Um, but at the end of the day, while things like Chat GPT and Google Translate can do okay, if you really want to be sure, it's probably still best to take it to someone who actually knows Italian.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Let's see. So our next question is, in the 1800s in northern Italy, were names entered in church records in Italian or in Latin?
Almost always in Latin.
Thank you. So we have one more question, and
Mhm.
that's on the diverse records. So where can
Uh-huh.
those usually be found, and how are they usually organized?
So think of them as like extra records. I mean, they're still primarily concerned with births, marriages, and deaths. It's just when things don't necessarily fit. They're organized under their own collection on Portale Antonati in the various regional archives, right? So the way it will go is you'll go to a particular archive with the big green button, basically, right? For like, say, in this case, I was in Pescara, right? And I located the village, in this case, Monte Silvano, and it breaks it down by what it has for Monte Silvano: births, marriages, deaths, military conscription, and diversity or diverse. So I just clicked on diverse and I started looking. And once again, then it goes numerically, right? So I knew he was born 1884, 1885. There was only about 5 pages in the 1884. One or two of them was simply about like a marriage that had not ended well, basically, and then the other was the breakdown of him being found in the adoption wheel, right? So once again, go to the village and look for the diverse records, and it's pretty straightforward from there. They're not Most of them aren't going to be more than like 10 to 20 pages.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And we had just one more that popped up. So are there any rules of thumb to translate Latin names back into Italian?
It's very close. Like, honestly, like, um, it, how do I put this? You know, in many respects, Italian is simply an evolution of Latin, right? Even more so than other Latin-based languages, like, say, French or Spanish. You can usually do it. Rule of thumb is a little hard. I would probably have to see the actual names and see what the larger context is, because that can be fairly revealing one way or the other.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mhm.
So I think that'll finish us up for today. So if anybody has any additional questions, or if you'd like a copy of the chat, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info, and that email address is in the chat. So we'll get that to you. So thank you, Logan, and thank you everybody for attending. Bye-bye.
Take care, folks.